turn to anything as we go through the session or later as we head through the next week or two, then you'll be able to do so. So yeah, we're recording, and yeah, please do feel free to get involved. Right, done that bit. So let's kind of put a bit of context to what we're going to talk about, and I'll flick through to that next slide in a second. So I guess it's kind of starting off and setting some context to today, really. So today is all around capability, and particularly around that next step of having done some exploration, thinking about what you want to move on to, and getting some clarity, and now hopefully feeling in a position where you can start to kind of be pushing yourself forward for opportunities. And the passport to that, in many cases, is a really well-crafted CV. So today's session is really going to be about thinking about how you can tell your story to a prospective employer, thinking about curating the content, the structure and the layout, so that you are presenting yourself with confidence and hopefully with success. So shortly you'll see a poll popping up in the box. So I'd really be interested in your thoughts on that as you get the chance to kind of engage with that. So let's get into the detail then, and let's kind of dive straight in because time is of the essence. So here we've got a bit of an overview of what the basic structure and the content might look like. So some headlines on the right there, really. What makes, or what's the kind of core of what makes great content in a CV? So if we were working kind of top down, these are some of the things I'd be recommending and advising. And if you've got a CV already, this might be a good chance to do a bit of a sense check against the list we've got here. Stating the obvious there, but first of all, the name and your contact details. So really important that this is really clear and kind of set out, usually at the top of your CV on that first page. When we come to contact details, typically you'll have the phone number, an email address, and it's worth thinking about, particularly if you're in your final stages with us here, is actually how what email address you might include in there in terms of a Leeds Beckett or a personal email address, whatever's going to be the most reliable as you head forward from here, I would say. In terms of address and information, it might be worth thinking about that. In terms of where you're looking and what opportunities you're looking at geographically. So I would certainly encourage you to think about, if you are putting a Leeds-based address but you're looking elsewhere, that you make that clear either in a supporting email or in the covering letter. Next kind of bit down, and we talk about a personal statement and profile, and this is the piece for me that is quite critical. And, I suppose I should context all of this, and I think someone will probably agree, is that there is an element of subjectivity when you're writing a CV, and then also when you're reviewing a CV, in terms of what makes good content and what you're looking for. And I think the personal statement is something that does and should take a bit of time to think it through and be really clear and succinct in. In terms of the content, you might see all sorts of examples of that. Often you'll see people describing themselves using lots of adjectives. I'm this, I'm a team player, I'm great, I'm great at leading. And I think it's really important to be able to always put that supporting evidence in anything you write in this statement. So my advice when it comes to the personal statement would to be keep it factual and keep it very clear. So really that's just your introduction. If you can imagine in your essay or writing an assignment, it's just setting the scene. It's a little bit about you in a nutshell. So that might be just that you are a graduate of Leeds Beckett, having studied X degree, and that you're looking to make this next step into X sector or into this type of role. In there, you might also include a few really unique selling features, unique things about you that really make you stand out and kind of create that instant first impression. Moving on then, and we'll return a little bit to this and talk about some USPs as we're going to go through later on into the session. Moving on then, so if we're kind of moving down the CV and the structure, then we then start to look at skills and achievements. And this is not the time on the CV to be shy and to be underplaying anything you've got. So when we look at around skills and achievements, we're thinking about probably the combination of both what you've learned and studied and what you've kind of achieved through your degree, and or any work experience, and or any volunteering, and or any other hobbies, interests, etc. that you've done. Then we're moving into education. And please make sure front and center, we said this session very specifically is about graduate. So make sure front and center your degree is part of that. then moving into employment, then volunteering, anything around digital and anything interesting, any interests if they're interesting. And I'm going to flick on to the next slide where we're giving a few more examples. So top 2 points we've covered a little bit already. So name and profile. Let's move on to talk about education then. So when it comes to the education, as I've mentioned, really make sure that you've got your degree fully listed, the full title, where you've studied, and the right and appropriate amount of detail. So kind of speaking with a couple of recruiters in the last week or two, talking around this section in particular, I think it's worth, thinking about your audience, thinking about the role you're going as to how much depth you might talk about here. If what you've studied is really relevant to the role and opportunity you're going to, then you might want to pick out some core modules that you've had, some specific results that you've had that show you've got a real interest and, building knowledge in that area. You might choose to put less or a little bit less information if you're making the leap into something that's not necessarily directly related to what you've studied. So it does need a bit of, all of this will need an element of personalisation as you go through. But certainly make sure you've got some good detail in there, and think about the things that you've done through your studies that you can take into the workplace, whether that be some of the skills and experiences you've had, whether it's because of some of the type of assignments that you've done, whether it's because you've been doing presentations. Get some of that content in there. Think about the things you've done, the skills you've learned through your degree that you would take into the workplace. And a lot of the stuff you're learning, it may not seem the content or the subject and topic might not always be directly relatable into the roles that you're looking at, but certainly the skills you've used and the experience of doing some of those things may well be. Moving into that employment section then, and this is again a good balance between getting the right amount of detail, showing what you've done, showing what kind of responsibility you've had, versus also then sort of oversharing and perhaps giving information that might not be as directly relevant to the sort of roles you're now looking at. So coming back to that point around graduate and graduate opportunities. So as a bit of a broad overview in terms of how you might lay it out, then listing out the role, the organisation you worked for, any kind of key achievements or responsibilities you've had I would say are really, really critical to include at this point. That middle section around tasks, again, is a fine balance between getting the right amount of information and oversharing. So let me give you an example here. So let's imagine that you've spent time as an undergraduate working in some kind of customer contact centre. So you may well have been, the nuts and bolts of that role may well have been picking up the phone, answering inbound, outbound, resolving queries, etc. So I might not spend a huge amount of time actually talking about the fact you were on the phone or that you were, the ins and outs of what you were having to do to process queries. However, you might spend more time talking about, what was required of you when you were doing that in terms of being able to handle, challenging customers, in terms of being able to communicate clearly, in terms of being able to, resolve issues responsibly, in terms of being able to problem solve. So think about what you're actually taking from the roles you've had, particularly if they don't seem directly relatable. There is always something you can draw out of experience that you've had, paid or unpaid, and never underplay anything you've done. And often we'll hear from students talking about, I only did this or it was only that. There is always something valuable that will be drawn out of whatever experience you've had. So make sure it's featured on there and put it in the right context. And anything in particular, so it's always useful to be able to show particular outcomes of things you've done. So let's imagine yourself back in that customer service role where you've had certain targets to hit and how you've gone about doing that and where you've kind of achieved things and gone above and beyond. And also think about any extra responsibility you've had. So sometimes I'll speak to students and they'll talk about how they've been given extra tasks to do. That's a great thing to show because it's definitely represented how you've gone into the role, you've shown commitment, and then people have given you extra things. So you've kind of created a reputation for yourself and you want to try and get that across on the CV. Moving then down the list, and this is by no means absolutely exhaustive, but trying to take the kind of broad themes of what we might expect or what we see from student and graduate CVs coming through. So great to mention anything you've done that's kind of beyond university, beyond working world as well. So if you've got any volunteering experience, any community work, I know a lot of students have been engaging in activities like that. particularly over the last few months. So make sure you signpost those, and you might want to differentiate those in terms of how you title them, just to kind of show what you were doing that was kind of paid in a paid capacity, and maybe anything you've done that's in a volunteering capacity. Next section, I've kind of called it industry focus. You might choose to get the right or a different title, but kind of industry skills might be particularly, might be a good way to summarize it. And I think that then comes into anything that you've done, thinking about the area and the direction you might want to head in that might be very relevant to the kind of roles that you're looking at. So I've used the example around digital skills, but if you've been using, certain technical platforms or IT platforms, if you're really competent on certain social media, if you're used to networking, if you've done some particular training or some extra qualifications, think about how you might get those across in your CV. That also shows what kind of commitment you've already taken to move yourself and to prepare yourself for heading down a particular pathway after university. And then the final one, and this is sometimes the interesting one. So interests, so anything you're involved in extracurricular, maybe interests or hobbies that you've got outside of your work and studies. So I think this is a chance to show a little bit more about you and personality, but think about the interests and make sure they are interesting. So you might see examples of, I like reading, I watch films. And I think, that's the sort of stuff that a lot of people write on. And it's certainly the kind of thing that's often a conversation starter in interviews. So, be prepared to perhaps embellish on that a little bit. And I would include that if you've got something that really is an interest and a passion, get it on. If it's not something that you'd want to talk about for any length of time, then you might keep that off. There's one final point I wanted to mention on this slide, which doesn't feature, but which I'll often see kind of on CVs, and that's the question around references or some kind of mark around references. My kind of take on that would be, and I've kind of had a previous life working in HR, is typically you wouldn't take that if you were moving to that next stage of actually securing references. Employers will often re-ask or ask again for that kind of information. So thinking that, space is really important in the CV, you want to maximize the space you've got, I would say that actually it's not something you need to put on, and it's something that they'll come back to you about if they want to progress to that next stage. So in some senses, it wastes a bit of space. And on that point around what kind of is I suppose, optimum length of a CV, we tend to look at around a couple of sides being kind of about right in terms of the time that you will have to look at it. And that brings me nicely onto the poll, which I can see a few of you have been adding some comments to, which is great. So the question I posed at the start is, how long does a recruiter typically spend reviewing a CV? This is one of those kind of questions that kind of floats around, and all sorts of kind of queries and sort of thoughts go around it. Well, the latest or the last time I read this, then and I was on a call a couple of weeks ago with a recruiter doing something similar, and the answer that she gave was 8 seconds. So if we take that as a worst case scenario, then when we talk about content, getting the right and curating that just right, it makes it really critical. So if you've got 8 seconds, both to tell your story and visually present that story, you've really got to make your CV work absolutely perfectly for you. So I'd definitely say spending time getting the content right, using every word in the best manner you can, and using it really wisely, but then also thinking about that kind of visual impact as well. And you don't have to be super creative to make something look stunning. There's lots of kind of pre-prepared templates that you can use, and we've got some great examples that we can direct you to on our systems as well. Okay, so thanks for your comments on that. A few questions coming in. So, okay, let's just pick that up then. Lois has asked, if I've had a work experience that is not closely related to my current career, does it need to be on my CV? And we've got a second question asking the same thing. My advice there, I kind of go back to my point. I think all experience is great experience. So I would say, you might want to think how much space you might give over to that role. But I think it's really good at this early stage, potentially, to show that work history. It does articulate, I think, to an employer that kind of work ethic, that mindset, that approach, the fact that you have been in a position of paid responsibility potentially. If that work experience is voluntary, you might want to think about whether it adds to what you've got already, or whether it's not significant enough that you want to include it. But I generally say at this early stage, you want to gather together all of your experiences as best, in the best way that you can, but you might give over more space to those that are more significant and perhaps they've lasted for a longer period of time. Right, let's move on. So what do we talk about, or why do we talk about a graduate CV then? This is, I suppose, the question around what makes an employer want to recruit a graduate. And kind of harking back myself again to kind of previous life, then, I want to kind of share hopefully a positive message for you that what we're seeing in terms of what's happening in the labour market is that proportionately graduate roles and graduate opportunities, whilst not completely unaffected by COVID, they are standing still quite positively. So I think we've seen drops of maybe 10, 12, 15% in terms of opportunities, but that still means there's a lot of good stuff out there. So, graduates are still in demand. And I think a lot of that is about, the skills and attributes that you come with as a graduate. Those attributes around kind of curiosity, interest, adaptability, being able to kind of come with a level of thinking, problem solving, kind of resilience, adaptability, all of those things that you'll have been building and learning, and not least in the last few months as you've adapted to this kind of new way of learning and teaching. So there's still plenty of demand here. And I think the other point to mention is just how many jobs are open to any degree background as well. So around about 85, 86, 87% in the latest surveys of opportunities pitched at graduates are open to any graduate. And so that's an important point to know, I think, in terms of heading into this next phase in job hunting. So let's move ourselves on then. And I wanted to move on really with this message around any degree and adapting and applying yourself to different settings. And this for me is one of the important kind of points really around the skills you're taking forward as a graduate. And a bit of a beef on my part really is this kind of concept of soft skills. So I'd encourage you to be thinking about what skills you're bringing, what skills you can take into another environment. Some of those core attributes I've just articulated that employers talk to us, and when we look at job specs or when we look at adverts, are often articulated on those. And my little mission to rebrand is to kind of describe those not as soft skills, but actually as vital skills. And I think, for me, importantly, these are the things that help you, kind of make things happen in the workplace. So knowledge is great and understanding is great, but actually for many organizations, that knowledge and the things you need to know in that organization are so often unique that you couldn't teach or train or come in knowing those things. But what you can bring in is those skills, that team spirit, that confidence, the communication, the inquisitiveness, those kind of skills that help you be able to learn and then, do the things you need to do in the workplace. So that's a really important point. So think about how you might articulate those vital skills, either through how you example your work experience that you've had so far and the skills you've picked up there, and also how you talk about the things you've done in your degree as well. So keep those vital skills in mind. And I'm going to give you an example. I know it's probably not the best thing to see on screen. So this is probably my worst slide. I'll give you the alert there for the session today. But this is an example of what, graduate recruiters say they're looking for from graduates. And if you look, there's kind of two elements to this graph here. One talks about the yellow band is about, the purple band is, the yellow band is the employers and how many graduates they believe come with that skill already. And the purple band is how many employers feel they have to train or support graduates in building up that skill. So here's a chance to make a bit of differentiation for yourself. If you're already working on some of these things, particularly those in that kind of upper half of that graph, then, get them down. Make sure you're showing some of those things in action, be it on the CV and when you get a chance to hopefully through to interview stage to actually kind of share some examples around that. So the point on the side is really about talking the language. So think about what's written in the job spec. Think about what employers are talking that they look about. How can you weave some of that language in specifically when you are talking about the skills and experiences you've got? So back to that 8-second rule. as a recruiter, as you're looking through the CV, if you're starting to see some of these words emerge, you're kind of looking through and going tick, tick, tick. This sounds like the kind of person that's coming with the right mindset and some of the skills that I'm looking for from my next recruit. So think about how you weave in the right language and talk in the tone of the recruiter. So bespoke, the buzzword, making it personal. And I think this is probably one of the things that is the most important thing in those 8 seconds of reviewing a CV. You know, we want to see an element. You want to try and get across as much about you as an individual in those those couple of pages, enough to intrigue and to encourage and want to be able to then meet you in person, albeit virtually, as it will be at the moment. So it's trying to get a bit around your personality across. And kind of get a bit of an insight into who you are as an individual. So the kind of rule of thumb is be factual, yes, of course, but now is not the time to be modest. So, this is the time to kind of play up your experience and talk about the things that are really unique to you. And the other aspect of being personal comes back to kind of pulling out things that are identified in the job advert and the job spec. So whilst you might have a core setup with your CV, the good practice is always to be going back to that CV and tinkering and tailoring with that CV as you're applying for opportunities, and also then tailoring that initial introduction, be it through an email introduction or if you've been asked officially for a covering letter. It's really important that you show you've kind of read the application, you've read what they're looking for, and you've weaved that into your response. Again, it comes back to using the language, answering the questions that they're asking. So, let's take this as an example, and this is just one whizzed off one of our opportunities that we've been advertising. It talks very specifically about some knowledge that they're looking for and some technical knowledge. But it also talks about some of those vital, unique skills that we've talked about, the communication, working in a team, kind of showing that interest and genuine interest. So it's really important to get those boxes ticked, to make sure those 8 seconds count, that you get as much of that information tailored into your application. So, it may be that you're rewriting your CV, and in fact, it should be that you're tinkering with your CV every time you're going for an application, and particularly tinkering with that kind of introductory email or covering letter. Really, really important. That's the way to stand out, to show, each time you've taken or made an application, you've really thought about why that role is of interest to you and why you're someone they should see. So making the connections, this is a bit of a build really on what I was saying right at the start around the profile. So trying to take the statements that you might say about yourself and embellish them a little bit more. So let me kind of look at trying to play this in terms of what you might say and then what might go through the mind of the recruiter. So you might see on someone's CV, I'm a team player. Okay, I want to know more about that teamwork. So what teams have you been in? What role have you played? And what examples might you give of where that team approach, team ethic has really played dividends? So what outcomes have you had from that? Okay, I'm organized. Great. So how does that help you with this role? I took customer orders. This is back to the example around the work you might have done. So, okay, let's think about the skills you needed to do that. Yeah. And to do that well, being able to communicate, ask good questions, and being able to kind of accurately record things, being able to resolve issues, etc. Okay. Final one, I'm a student, I'm studying a degree in sport. Okay, great. You might be applying it into that industry. You might be looking at something else. What I want to know is, what have you learned from that? The last 3-4 years you've invested in that. What are the things that have developed in you? What are the experiences, the attributes you've got now that you're going to bring to my organisation? And I suppose the key point is do the heavy lifting. Make sure that you're making it easy to say yes. So rather than leaving the recruiter to try and join the dots up and make those connections, I'd encourage you to think about how you make the connections for them. And this comes back to the kind of USPs then. So I don't know, I've used this term quite a lot, but I suppose hopefully the visual explains a little bit more about it. But USPs is simply unique selling points. And I think this is probably my final point I'd want to kind of highlight really on the CV. And if you're going back and doing a bit of an audit on the CV that you've already got, I encourage you to think about, as you tell your story, what are the really crunch points you want to get across, the things that you can talk about that nobody else can. And that's when you start to get to, in that position of the blue penguin, the person that just stands out a little bit above the pile of other CVs that I might be looking through. So think about those, one, maybe two things that you've got that are really unique to you that you can own and create that story around and that intrigue. And that will give you a kind of good base, I think, to get a few kind of really interesting things out and kind of create that intrigue enough that you might then move on to the next stage. And I think that's the point in terms of those are the kind of things that help you into that yes pile rather than no. And I think the other aspect of that is going into the detail of things. So it is those finer details around, kind of spelling, presentation, grammar, getting all of that absolutely spot on and that attention to detail and looking really sharp. So get the content good and then think about how it looks and all of those finishing touches. I don't want to spend or haven't got time to spend too much time on here. And for those of you that want to stay on a little longer, then we've got a little bit. We can do a little Q&A as well. But just want to mention around CVs online. So we talked a lot about this yesterday. So there's some catch-up sessions you can do, particularly around LinkedIn yesterday. But again, if you've worked on the content of your CV offline, or in a kind of a hard copy, if you like, then this, get that online. And if you're not already on there, I think that's probably one of the major calls to action this week. We're finding a lot of recruiters are using LinkedIn more than ever before, really. So make sure you've got it online. So here's a few things then, a few tips for you to take away. So think about what the right style of CV might be. I've talked particularly, and I've kind of framed this as a graduate CV and some of that core graduate content that you might want to get across there. It may be that it's more applicable, a different style of CV, depending on what you're going for, and or a CV might just be a part of the overall package you're presenting, particularly, in areas like the arts where you might have some work that you're also accompanying that in terms of portfolio and creative and design work. If you're starting from scratch, then we've got the CV builder that you can access. We've got CV 360, these are all available online for you through MyHub and the careers pages of MyHub. So the CV 360 is a quick and easy way to give a sense check of what your CV's looking like now and any feedback. And that's just a case of uploading your CV into the system and it will give you quite a detailed breakdown. So if you're at that point of reviewing, then that's a good place to start. We've got a whole host of resources online in terms of CV guides. Of course, you can come back and have a check-in with the team. So we've got appointments happening tomorrow. Brilliant. Summer's just posted the 360 link in the chat there. So that's a really good starting point if you're kind of building from what you've already got. We've got appointments available tomorrow if anybody's got their CV in a reasonable shape now and would like some individual feedback, and we've got appointments that will run right through the summer, so take a chance to get some one-to-one and personalized feedback. And then finally, just to plug MyHub, we've got took a stat on this at the start of the week actually for a session I was running on Monday. There were 168 or I think live jobs on MyHub. All sorts of opportunities. We've been particularly building up the graduate jobs on there. So if you haven't been looking on MyHub, I'd really encourage you to do so, because there's certainly, we're kind of keeping a constant scan on the latest sort of roles and opportunities. So it's a good place to start and amongst other platforms. And then the final call to action for today is actually to go and take Career Pulse. So that's a way to just see where you're at with things and give you a bit of a focus as to what you might need to do next. It looks at the whole career journey, really, from going from exploring and thinking about what ideas you might have right through to how confident you might feel about actually putting yourself forward for an opportunity. So Career Pulse is definitely the call to action for today. And then finally, just popping in any feedback. So let us know how you found the session, any kind of thoughts and ideas. We're kind of racing through in half an hour. And so please do pop in any comments in the chat box there in terms of anything that would be useful for us to know. I just want to mention a couple of things coming up for the rest of the day then. So kind of after this session, we've got a session on virtual assessment centres starting. Then we're moving on to CVs and interviews in a bit more detail. So bringing that CV into the interview space, that's happening later on this afternoon. And then a session on application forms and the STAR technique. So looking again how you might structure some of your examples around that. Whistled through that. if there are any questions, then quite happy to stay on the chat. And I don't know, I'm sure Summer will be too, just to kind of answer any specific questions that people might have. Yeah, please do pop into the chat box any thoughts on or any questions that you might have. But thanks ever so much for taking part and joining in the session so far. And please do, yeah, pop in any questions that you might have in that chat box. Okay. While you're still on then, Summer, any thoughts from you in terms of anything else that you kind of see when you get, you know, kind of emails through into the inbox?
I think you made a really good point about tailoring CVs. As a student, that was not something I considered at all. It was like, I've got a CV, I'll just send it. But tailoring is really important. I once read a CV that they'd obviously applied for a number of jobs and it had a different company's name on it. And it's those little things that really kind of put you at the bottom of the pile. Without sounding harsh, they'll just go, not interested. They obviously haven't, you know, made the effort. So tailoring the CV is really important. And again, if you've kind of gone through this session and you're a little bit concerned, you're like, I haven't got anything to put under experience, or I've never done any volunteering, and that's an area you want to improve on, then now's the time while you're at uni. You know, you can do it alongside studying. The student union have really good like opportunities for volunteering, getting involved in societies, or, you know, we've got our My Hubs jobs board, which has got loads of part-time jobs, loads of summer jobs, and we offer placements and whatnot as well. So loads of opportunities.
Yeah, great. We've got a question popped up actually. Thanks very much for that. Yeah, I give it a thumbs up. So how far do we go back mentioning our academic background? Well, I think anything you've studied and any kind of formal qualifications you've got are worth listing. I mean, again, coming back to the point, and we've deliberately kind of created this session or titled this session as graduate, then I think the most recent experience and educational experience needs to get the most airtime, I would say, especially if you're looking to use your graduate CV to apply for graduate jobs. Then you need to show that that's, you know, part of how you qualify to be in that mix. So I would, you know, any kind of, like I say, formal qualifications, but just think about how much detail. So kind of depending on where you've studied, if I think just of the system here, then you might just explain, you know, back to GCSEs, how many you might have. Often it's of interest to know how you've scored in some of the core kind of numeracy and literacy. So in maths and English, you might often get asked what kind of grade you've got around that. And then likewise with A levels or equivalent, any kind of key qualifications or you've got, but probably in terms of time and space, that could probably take a couple of lines for each of those. I don't think it's necessarily something that you need to spend an awful lot of detail in. So hopefully that answers a question. Just popped in that question. There's a few of you still on the call. If you're still here, do let us know what and how you found the session in terms of any feedback. Any final bits of advice then, Summer?
I'm just thinking about the educational one, actually. I read a CV the other day and somebody had taken an A4 page listing their GCSEs. And I mean, you mentioned it, just sum it up. So I've got 11 GCSEs. So I just put 11 GCSEs, A star to C, and the name of the school that I went to. And that's literally it. No one ever asked me about them, to be honest. I've got a degree. So it kind of counts that out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, kind of the further into the distance that becomes, then, you know, it always feels very important at the time. But I think, like I say, it's really important to get that degree kind of front and centre, really, particularly if you're heading and looking at roles that require that graduate accolade. So, yeah, great. Okay, well, I think given it's a little quiet on the chat, so we shall call it and stop recording there. Just to say, hope you're enjoying Beckett, Beyond Beckett this week, and please do kind of keep tuned and take part in the other sessions either today or go back later on. As we head into next week, we'll be making sure that all the recordings are available through My Hub. So thanks again, and hope to catch up with you all soon. Okay, take care. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.